In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about ideas and ways of thinking and how these changed, and particularly talk about how these changes in thinking affected British history. Between the Middle Ages and the modern world, there were two main intellectual changes which took place. The first one we call the Renaissance, and the second is often referred to as the Age of Reason. The Renaissance, the word means the rebirth of learning, started in the 15th century in Italy. It came to Britain a little later, in the 16th century, about the time of Elizabeth I's father, Henry VIII. Intellectually, it was a very exciting time. It was the time when Europeans discovered the history of Greece and Rome, and people in Europe started studying all the interesting things written by the people of the ancient world, ancient Greece. During the long period, from the end of the Roman Empire until that time, until the Renaissance, people in Europe had generally forgotten a lot of the things that were known in the ancient world. And many of these ideas were very new to the people of Europe at the time, despite the fact that they were often 1,000 years old. And these ideas led to new ways of thinking, which started to change society in many ways. Some of the changes, of course, were in religion and led to attacks on the Catholic Church and the movement towards Protestantism. And I think we can see the Renaissance as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning, if not the beginning of the modern world, at least the beginning of the transition to the modern world. And this new learning, or the rediscovery of the old learning, led to much new thinking. By the end of the 17th century, many new discoveries of science started to change people's lives. The first important new discovery, or very important new discovery, came in 1687 when an Englishman called Isaac Newton published his important work on the law of gravity. And Newton also made other discoveries which now form the basis of the science of physics. His contribution to science was probably greater than any other person ever, or certainly greater than any other person at that time. And he had a huge influence on the thinking of men of his own time, as well as on later scientific thought. A famous English poet, a chap called Alexander Pope, wrote about Newton. He said, "Nature and nature's laws were hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Other important new discoveries were made. For example, a Dutchman called Leeuwenhoek used a microscope to discover bacteria, and a whole new world of tiny creatures, which had been invisible before, was discovered. Robert Hooke discovered that living matter was made of tiny cells. And at the end of the 17th century, Robert Boyle did experiments with gases, and he became known as the father of modern chemistry. And as the 18th century progressed, more and more discoveries were made. During the 18th century, what we call the scientific method developed and became quite common. This is the idea that nothing should be accepted as true unless it has been proved so by experiment. And this scientific method, this very simple idea, is the basis of the development of modern science. Without it, we would have very little knowledge of physics or chemistry. Without the scientific method, we would probably be living in a world without cars, telephones, televisions, or any of the other important inventions made in the last 200 years. The 18th century is often called the Age of Reason because of this. In the 18th century, many people tried to use this way of thinking in all sorts of fields of study. Not only science, but thinkers and writers of this period tried to test everything by observation. They tried to find cause and effect relationships in everything. They believed generally that truth could be found by logical thinking, that is, by reasoning, and hence the Age of Reason. These attitudes, of course, affected philosophers and political scientists. John Locke believed that the relationship, for example, between the ruler and the ruled, that is, between the king and his people, was a type of agreement. So if the ruler did not do his job well, then the people had a right to remove him because the ruler was breaking his agreement. And these were very radical new ideas. It's only 100 years before that Charles I, the king who was beheaded after the civil war in England, after his war between Parliament and himself, Charles I had believed that the king was sent by God to rule the people. Now, 100 years later, John Locke's ideas were very, very different. In France, a man called Jacques Rousseau was an influential writer. He believed that man was born good, but became bad because of his environment. That is, he became bad because of his education and his laws. And these were very new ideas at the time, and of course many people didn't like them, but the idea was developing at that time that a man had the right to his own opinions. This was the important idea of free speech, and this is a new development, a characteristic we take for granted in the modern world, but this developed during the 18th century. For example, another Frenchman called Voltaire made a very famous statement. He said, "I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." These are very, very radical new ideas. So the development of the scientific method and the freedom to express new ideas led to modern science and developments which changed the world completely.